All right, so was Trump's presidency a total anomaly or you know what I mean? Like, did he rewrite the rules of the game or just sort of riff on what other presidents had already done?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think historians are going to be wrestling with that one for a long
Oh,
time.
for sure, for
Huh.
sure. And we've got a lot to unpack here. We're looking at comparisons between Trump and, well, a whole bunch of big names. Andrew Jackson,
Yeah.
Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, even Theodore Roosevelt, and Herbert Hoover.
Yeah, quite the lineup.
So are these just superficial comparisons? Just kind of like, oh, they both like to tweet or something? Or do they actually reveal something deeper about Trump and his, where he fits in the whole presidential story?
Well, I think the key here is to go beyond just, the surface level similarities, right? I
Right.
mean, like you said, anyone can point out that two presidents were both tall or something.
Right, right.
What's more interesting is to look at how they wielded power, the political climate they were operating, and the tools they used to get their message across.
Okay, so let's start digging in. And maybe the most common comparison you hear is between Trump and Andrew Jackson,
Yeah.
the people's president, champion of the common man, all that.
Yeah, the OG populist.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But how similar were they really? I mean, they're brands of populism. It seems like they were tapping into very different things, right?
Yeah, and that's what makes it so interesting to compare them. On the surface level, they both definitely campaigned as outsiders,
Oh, yeah.
railing against the elites, promising to return power to the people. But I think their approaches were really different, reflecting the anxieties of their different eras.
So Jackson was all about that frontier spirit, right?
Yeah, very much so. He really embodied that rugged individualism that was so appealing to voters in the early 1800s.
And he took on the second bank of the United States, which I guess was like this symbol of, concentrated economic power.
Exactly. He saw it as a threat to individual liberty.
Okay, now, for those of us who maybe slept through that part of history class, can you remind us what the second bank actually was and why it was so controversial?
Sure. It was essentially a national bank chartered by the federal government, and it had a lot of control over the nation's money supply.
Ah, so it kind of sounds like the swamp that Trump was always talking about, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was this shadowy network of elites that seemed to be calling the shots, and both Jackson and Trump really tapped into that deep-seated suspicion of centralized power.
So they both positioned themselves as these outsiders fighting against a rigged system. And that really resonated with voters who felt like they'd been left behind.
Exactly. They were masters of channeling that anger and frustration into a powerful political force.
Okay, but how did Trump's version of populism differ from Jackson's? I mean, they were separated by almost 200 years.
Right. Well, Trump was tapping into 21st century anxieties, right? Things like globalization, economic inequality, the feeling that the American dream was slipping away.
So while Jackson was fighting against a powerful bank, Trump was fighting against what almost felt like he was fighting against the future itself.
Yeah, in a way he was speaking to people who felt like the world was changing too fast and that they were being left behind.
And that brings us to another president who was really good at channeling that kind of anger and frustration, Richard Nixon.
Ah, yes. Another president who definitely didn't shy away from a fight.
Especially with the media. He and Trump both had famously combative relationships with the press. What are some of the parallels you see in their media strategies?
Well, both of them definitely understood the power of media,
Oh, absolutely.
but they chose to engage with it in very different ways, and I think that reflects the changing media landscape. I mean, Nixon was very much a creature of his time.
Yeah, he was notoriously private and controlled, trying to manage the media narrative through carefully crafted press releases and, staged events.
Exactly. He saw the media as a powerful force that had to be carefully controlled.
But then comes Trump, and he completely throws out the old playbook.
He does. I mean, he basically bypassed the traditional media altogether and took his message directly to the people.
Redirect.
Exactly. It was a game changer. He could set the agenda, attack his opponents, even announce major policy decisions, all without the filter of the mainstream media.
And that direct connection with his base was incredibly powerful. It allowed him to build this us versus them dynamic where he was the victim of a hostile media establishment and his supporters were the only ones who could be trusted.
Right. It was very similar to Nixon's strategy during Watergate, where he painted himself as the victim of a witch hunt by the media and the political establishment.
So they both used this kind of siege mentality to deflect criticism, discredit their opponents, and rally their base.
Exactly. They understood that perception is often more powerful than reality, especially in politics.
And speaking of scandals, both Nixon and Trump faced these massive controversies that threatened to derail their presidencies. but they both managed to survive, at least for a while. What did you notice about their approaches to political survival?
Well, one big difference is that Nixon ultimately resigned under pressure.
Yeah, he knew when to fold them.
He did. Trump, on the other hand, he fought on. I mean, he never conceded defeat even after he lost the 2020 election.
Right. He was a fighter, no doubt about it. And I think that really highlights their different approaches to power. Nixon was, at heart, a pragmatist. He understood the rules of the game and knew when to cut his losses.
He did.
Trump, on the other hand, he seemed to operate by a completely different set of rules. He was a showman, a disruptor, who seemed to thrive on chaos and confrontation.
Right. He almost seemed to relish the role of the outsider, the one who was willing to break the rules and challenge the status quo, and that really appealed to a certain segment of the population.
People who were tired of business as usual and wanted someone to shake things up.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've seen how Trump's populism differed from Jackson's and how his media strategy contrasted with Nixon's.
Right.
But what about his economic policies? Were there any parallels to be found there?
Yeah, and that's where things get really interesting because while Trump often presented his economic policies as this radical departure from the past.
Right, a total break from the establishment.
Right, there are actually some surprising similarities to be found with previous presidents.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Who are we talking about here?
Well, like the most compelling comparisons, I think, is with Ronald Reagan.
Reagan. Really? I mean, on the surface, they seem so different. Reagan was the great communicator known for his optimism and his ability to inspire. And Trump, well, Trump was often divisive and confrontational.
Oh, totally different personalities. But when you dig into their economic policies, there are some striking similarities.
Like what? What specific policies did they share?
Well, they both championed tax cuts, deregulation, and a strong pro-business agenda. They both believed that unleashing the power of the free market was the key to economic growth and prosperity.
So they had similar philosophies, even if they had very different styles.
Exactly. And I think that's where the comparison with Reagan gets really fascinating because Reagan was incredibly successful in framing his economic policies as a return to traditional American values, a rejection of big government, and a reaffirmation of individual liberty.
And Trump, in many ways, was trying to do the same thing.
He was. It's just that he was doing it in a very different political and cultural context.
It's like he was trying to tap into the same wellspring of economic anxiety that Reagan had tapped into decades earlier, but with a 21st century twist.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered Jackson, Nixon, and Reagan. That's 3 down and 2 to go.
And they're perhaps the most surprising comparisons of all.
Yeah, we're getting into some pretty uncharted territory here.
We are.
So who are the final 2 presidential contenders in the Trump comparison game?
Theodore Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover.
Whoa, now those are some curveballs. How on earth do those guys fit into the picture?
Well, believe it or not, there are some intriguing parallels to be found.
Okay, I'm all ears. Lay it on me.
So with Theodore Roosevelt, the comparison might seem a bit counterintuitive at first. Right?
Yeah, Roosevelt was a progressive reformer, the trustbuster, the conservationist.
Mm-hmm.
Not exactly a Trumpian figure.
Right. But they both had this very assertive leadership style. They projected strength, and they weren't afraid to challenge the status quo.
Interesting. Okay, so give me some specifics. How are their approaches to leadership similar?
Well, for one thing, they were both strong advocates for American power and influence in the world. They weren't afraid to project strength, and they were willing to use military force when they thought it was necessary.
So even though their domestic policies were pretty different, they had a similar worldview when it came to America's role in the world.
Yeah, and they both understood the importance of bold actions and strong rhetoric. You know, they weren't afraid to ruffle some feathers on the world stage.
I can see that. Okay, so what about Herbert Hoover? That one seemed like a real head-scratcher. I mean, he's often seen as this tragic figure, a president who was just overwhelmed by the Great Depression. How does he fit into the Trump story?
Well, when you dig into their backgrounds and their approaches to government, there are some interesting similarities.
Okay, I'm listening.
Both of them came into office with successful business backgrounds, and they both promised to apply their private sector expertise to the challenges facing the nation.
So they were both outsiders, in a way, promising to shake up the system.
Exactly. And they also shared a belief in limited government and a skepticism of social programs.
But Hoover's presidency is most closely associated with the Great Depression, which was a time of massive government intervention in the economy. How does that square with his supposed belief in limited government?
Well, that's the interesting part. Hoover's initial response to the Depression was actually marked by a reluctance to expand government spending and intervention.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he thought the economy would eventually right itself and that too much government interference would actually make things worse.
So he was kind of a precursor to the modern libertarian movement.
Yeah, in a way he was. And this is where the comparison with Trump gets interesting, because while Trump definitely embraced government intervention in some areas like trade policy, he also shared Hoover's skepticism of social programs and his belief that the private sector was the engine of economic growth.
So even though they were separated by almost a century, they had a similar worldview when it came to the role of government in the economy.
Yeah, and it's these kinds of comparisons that make studying history so fascinating, right? They help us see how certain ideas and philosophies transcend specific individuals and historical moments.
Right. It's like we're looking for these echoes and patterns in American political thought.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've looked at Jackson, Nixon, Reagan, Roosevelt, and even Hoover. And it seems like Trump shares some traits with all of them, but he's also unique in his own way. It's like he took bits and pieces from all these different presidents and created something entirely new.
Yeah, he's a tough one to categorize. He really defies our traditional ways of thinking about presidential leadership.
He does.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, which president does he actually resemble the most?
That is the question, isn't it? And it's one that we're going to tackle head on when we come back after a quick break. So don't go anywhere.
Stay tuned, folks, because we're about to reveal the presidential doppelganger that our expert thinks Trump most resembles. It's going to be good.
It is. So which president does Trump resemble the most? You know,
Yeah.
it's really tough to pick just one. He's like a composite sketch, you know, bits and pieces of a lot of different guys.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's complicated. But if you had to choose one, who would it be? Which comparison is the most, I don't know, the most insightful?
Okay, if I'm really pressed to choose, I'd say Andrew Jackson.
Really, Jackson. But their backgrounds are so different. Their paths to power were totally opposite. Jackson was a war hero, right? And Trump, well, Trump was a reality TV star.
Exactly. And that's what makes the comparison so fascinating. It shows how populism can look really different depending on the context, you know, the anxieties and fears of the time.
Right, right. So Jackson, he was tapping into that frontier spirit, distrust of big government, all that stuff.
Yeah, very much so. It was a young nation back then, and people were wary of concentrated power.
And Trump, he was tapping into anxieties about globalization, economic displacement,
Yeah.
the feeling that the American dream was slipping away.
Right, exactly. It was a different kind of fear, but that same underlying current of resentment, of being left behind by the elites, that was there in both cases.
And they both promised to shake things up, to return power to the people.
They did. They were both masters at channeling that anger and frustration into political power. And, they were both pretty good at using the media of their time, too.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Well-
Jackson had his partisan newspapers, and Trump had Twitter.
Right. Different tools, but the same basic instinct to control the narrative, to bypass the gatekeepers and connect directly with the people.
Okay, so speaking of media savvy, let's circle back to Nixon for a second. We talked about his media strategy, but what about the way he actually governed? Did he and Trump share a similar approach to wielding power once they were in office?
They did. They both had this strongman persona, They weren't afraid to use executive power to get things done.
Like Nixon expanding the Vietnam War without congressional approval, or Trump imposing tariffs on China without really consulting Congress.
Exactly. They both had this belief that they were uniquely equipped to lead, and that the normal rules didn't necessarily apply to them.
Right, and they both faced a lot of pushback from the establishment.
They did. They both saw the establishment as a threat to their power, and I think they both used that to their advantage.
By painting themselves as victims, fighting against a corrupt system.
Exactly. It's classic grievance politics. You tap into a sense of resentment, and then you channel that into political power.
And it worked for both of them, at least for a while.
It did.
They were both pretty polarizing figures, though, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. They weren't afraid to use divisive rhetoric to achieve their goals.
All right, so we've got Jacksonian populism, Nixonian media tactics, and a shared penchant for, let's say, assertive leadership.
Right.
But what about economic policy? Where does Reagan fit into all of this?
Reagan. Well, I think the comparison with Reagan gets at the heart of what some people call Trumpism. It's this blend of economic populism and social conservatism.
Okay, break that down for me. How did Reagan embody that?
He was really good at speaking to the anxieties of both working-class voters and social conservatives. He talked about shrinking government and cutting taxes, which appealed to the economic populists, but he also emphasized traditional values and morality, which resonated with the social conservatives.
And Trump, he kind of did the same thing, right? Promising to bring back jobs and renegotiate trade deals for the economic populists, and then taking a hard line on immigration and social issues for the social conservatives.
Exactly. He was following the Reagan playbook in a lot of ways, and
Mm.
just like Reagan, he was very good at tapping into a sense of nostalgia.
Right, like Make America Great Again. It's basically the same message as Morning in America, just with a different slogan.
Right. They both understood that you have to connect with people on an emotional level, give them a simple, clear vision of what America should be, and promise to take them back to that.
Okay, so we've talked about Jackson, Nixon, and Reagan. We're almost out of presidents here.
Mm.
Just Theodore Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover left to go. How do they fit into this puzzle?
Okay, so with Roosevelt, it's less about specific policies and more about a certain style of leadership. Both Roosevelt and Trump, they had this larger-than-life persona, you know, this mold, assertive style that really commanded attention.
They were both showmen, in a way.
They were. They
Yeah.
understood the power of spectacle, of symbolism.
And they both believed in projecting American strength on the world stage.
Absolutely. They both believed that America should be a dominant force, and they weren't afraid to use force to achieve their goals.
Like Roosevelt's famous quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick."
Exactly. And Trump, he definitely wasn't afraid to flex America's military muscle either.
Okay, I can see the comparison there. So what about Hoover? He's often seen as a bit of a tragic figure, a president who was overwhelmed by the Great Depression. What are the parallels with Trump?
Well, as we talked about earlier, the comparison with Hoover is mostly about their shared belief in limited government and their skepticism of social programs.
But Hoover, he was also a progressive in a lot of ways, wasn't he? I mean, he did support government intervention in the economy, especially during the Depression.
That's true, but his initial response to the Depression was actually very hesitant. He didn't want to expand government spending or intervention too much.
So he was kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, huh? The old world of limited government and the new world of the welfare state.
He was. And that's where the comparison with Trump gets interesting, because Trump also seemed to be grappling with that tension, you know? He campaigned on shrinking government and cutting taxes, but then he also increased spending on things like infrastructure. And he bailed out farmers during the trade war with China.
So he wasn't a pure ideologue.
Mm-hmm.
He was more of a pragmatist, willing to bend his principles when it suited him.
Right. And I think that's something he shared with both Hoover and Reagan. They were all trying to navigate a changing world, and they all had to make compromises along the way.
Okay, so we've explored all these different comparisons, and it's clear that Trump was influenced by a lot of different presidents. But he was also his own man, right? A unique figure who defied easy categorization.
He was. So now I'm curious to hear what our listeners think. Which president do you think Trump most resembles? And more importantly, what do these comparisons tell us about American politics? About the enduring appeal of populism? About the challenges of leadership in a rapidly changing world?
Yeah, great questions. It's a lot to think about. Each of these comparisons gives us a different lens through which to view Trump's presidency. But ultimately, it's up to each of us to decide which one resonates most strongly.
Right. And maybe there's no single right answer. Maybe Trump was just so unique that he doesn't fit neatly into any of our existing categories.
That's a good point. But even if there's no easy answer, I think the act of comparing him to past presidents, of looking for those echoes and patterns, helps us understand him better. And it helps us understand the broader sweep of American history better, too.
It does. Because history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's a living thing. It's constantly shaping our present and our future.
Right. And that's what makes these deep dives so rewarding. They challenge us to think critically, to question our assumptions, and to see the world in new ways.
They do. And as you continue to ponder which President Trump resembles most, I think the most important comparison is the one you make between yourself and the leaders you choose to support.
Right. It's about engaging in thoughtful dialogue, challenging your own beliefs, and being an active participant in shaping the future of our democracy.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Okay, but before we move on, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've talked a lot about the similarities between Trump and past presidents, but what about the differences?
Ah, yes. The things that set him apart.
Exactly. Because while there are definitely echoes of the past in Trump's presidency, there are also elements that are completely new, things that represent a break from the norms and traditions that came before him.
Right. And those differences are just as important to understand as the similarities. If we want to grasp the full impact of his presidency, we need to look at both sides of the coin.
Okay, so here's a question for our listeners. As you continue to think about the legacy of Donald Trump, ask yourself this. What was truly unique about his presidency? What did he change, for better or for worse, that's going to have a lasting impact on American politics?
Those are the questions that historians are going to be wrestling with for years to come.
They are.
Hmm.
But by engaging in that debate, by grappling with those complex questions, I think we can all contribute to a deeper understanding of our own time.
Absolutely. And that's what these deep dives are all about, right? It's not just about learning facts and figures. It's about having a thoughtful conversation about the big questions that shape our world.
Exactly. And it's been great having this conversation with you today.
Likewise. And thanks to all of our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into the presidency of Donald Trump. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
Okay, so we've talked about how Trump was similar to all these other presidents, but what really set him apart, like what made him different?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the biggest differences was his use of social media, especially Twitter. No other president had ever used it like that before.
Right. I mean, he was constantly tweeting, like all the time. It was like this nonstop stream of consciousness.
Exactly. He was a master of what we call the attention economy, right? The attention economy. It's this idea that in the digital age, attention is like a currency. And Trump, he knew how to get people's attention.
Oh, yeah, he did. He was always in the headlines, always stirring things up. It was like he knew exactly how to push everyone's buttons.
He did. And he used that to his advantage. He basically bypassed the traditional media and created his own direct line to the public.
Yeah, he didn't need the newspapers or the TV networks. He could just tweet whatever he wanted, and everyone would hear it.
Which was both powerful and dangerous, right?
Yeah, how so?
Well, on the one hand, it allowed him to connect with voters in a way that no other president had ever done before. He could get his message out there without it being filtered or spun by the media.
Right, it was like this unfiltered, raw feed straight from the Oval Office.
Exactly. But on the other hand, it also created this echo chamber where his supporters were only exposed to his version of events.
And it made it really hard to have a reasoned debate about the issues. Everything was so polarized, so black and white.
It was. And, it also contributed to the rise of misinformation and conspiracy theories, which spread like wildfire on social media.
Yeah, that's true. So his use of social media was kind of a double-edged sword, right? It gave him a lot of power, but it also had some negative consequences for our political discourse.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the biggest legacies of his presidency, the way he changed the way we communicate about politics.
Right. It's like he rewrote the rules of the game.
He did.
Yeah.
And future presidents are going to have to figure out how to play by those new rules.
They will. It'll be interesting to see what they come up with.
It will.
So it seems like Trump was both a product of his time and a shaper of it, right?
Mm.
He tapped into these existing anxieties and divisions in society, but he also amplified them.
He did, and that's what makes his presidency so fascinating and so challenging to understand. He was both a symptom and a cause.
Yeah, he was a reflection of the times, but he also changed the times. He was a real game changer, that's for sure.
He was. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's clear that Donald Trump was a truly unique figure in American history. He may have borrowed from the playbook of past presidents, but he also did things that no one had ever done before.
He did. And his presidency will continue to be debated and discussed for years to come.
Oh, absolutely. But one thing's for sure. He left his mark on American politics.
He did. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has.
And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the presidency of Donald Trump. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into history.
Until then, keep exploring and keep asking those big questions.
That's what it's all about. See you next time.